Hi, today we are going to be looking at the Russian Civil War. And this is a pretty basic overview of the Russian Civil War. Obviously there's a lot more detail that can be learned through reading or other ways. So this overview is meant to give you enough so that you can actually digest more about the Civil War. You can see on there I've got the dates 1917 to 1920. Of course, exactly when it starts and exactly when it finishes is debatable, but certainly this is the time where we start to see most of the fighting. If we look at the stages of the Civil War, we can kind of divide it up into three. And some historians say that the first stage isn't part of the Civil War. Some say that it doesn't really start until 1918. But let's take a look. So if we look at stage one, this is from October 1917 when the Bolsheviks seize power. We start to see counter-revolutionary activity from the very outset. And that continues. It's not a full-blown war, but certainly the Bolsheviks do have to deal with some counter-revolutionary activity at that stage. But really it's stage two that we see a full outbreak of civil war. Very much from March 1918, we see the Allies, the former Russian Allies of course, Britain, France, America as well, intervening in what is happening in Russia. We know of course they hate the Bolsheviks. They hate the Bolsheviks even more for withdrawing from the war. Certainly by March 1918, remember, that's when we have our Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed and Russia has formally withdrawn from the war. Allied intervention starts at that stage, but as we'll see, I wouldn't say that it really is the main thrust of what's happening on the Civil War, but it certainly bolsters the development of a white army, and our white army are our major opponents against the Bolsheviks, who were called the Reds. As we go through that stage two, really our Red Army is most under threat in 1919. At that point it does look like the Whites will succeed in breaking through and pushing the Bolsheviks back towards Petrograd and Moscow. But that turns around, and by November 1920 the White forces have pretty much been defeated and pushed back, and in some cases having to be evacuated out of Russian territory. There is a third stage of the Russian Civil War that we can consider, and this is where Poland, wanting a bit of a land grab, starts a war, and we call it the Russo-Polish War, begins in 1920. To begin with, the Poles do very well and push the Bolsheviks right back, but the Bolsheviks are able to hold their ground, and then they are very happy to enter into an agreement with the Poles, and we see a peace treaty being signed in March 1921. So the main military activity we see happening is in 1918, 1919 and 1920. This map is a nice map. I think they've got the colours wrong on this one, because the yellow in the middle is really what we see controlled by the Bolsheviks by 1919. And you can see, let me try just... So you can see on this map that our whites are coming from a number of areas. Over here we have Admiral Kolchak, so his white forces are pushing in from this side. Down in the south we've got General Denikin, whose white forces are pushing up in these directions, and over in the west we have General Yudenich, who is pushing in, and as you can see gets very close here to Petrograd. We also of course have the Poles attacking on this side at different times, and we've also got some Cossacks getting into the action over here, really fighting on the side of the White Army. So we have White Army is pushing in from a number of different angles, and if only they had been coordinated, perhaps they would have defeated the Reds. But as we will see, the Reds are able to hold out, and having this central position around key cities and around the railway here and in on this part allows the Reds to maintain their territory, and due to an uncoordinated, really, attack from the Whites, the Reds are able to prevail. The other thing that you see on this map are the green sections. Now the green is where we have our allies in particular. So this is where we've got British and French troops, in particular over here. On the other side of Russia, all the way over in Vladivostok, we've got Japanese and American troops. But one of the things we'll talk about is that the Allies, while present and putting pressure on the Reds, don't necessarily get involved in a lot of head-on conflict with the Reds. Instead, we see their main role is actually supporting the White Army. This map is a lot cleaner and neater, and really does give us a nice overview of the most furthest points that the Whites reach. So remember I said that they were coming in from the east, and this is as far as Kolchak is able to get. From the south, they push up quite significantly through all of this region and are pretty close to Moscow here, as you can see, at one point. But again, they are pushed back by the Reds, and eventually this southern army actually has to be evacuated out of the Crimea, and that's the Reds seize control back of all of this area here. Over in the west, as we can see, General Yudenich does push forward quite significantly all the way to the outskirts of Petrograd, but again, at a different point, they are pushed back and the Reds take back control of all of this territory. And the Americans and the English and the French also have to pull out from the north. You can also see on this map two different groups. So I'm going to colour this one here, Makhno, in green. We could colour them in green or black. Makhno was leading some partisans who were mostly peasant-based and very much looking to fight back against both the Reds and the Whites. And sometimes we see them fighting against the Reds, and at other times we see them fighting on the Red side. And another group, which I'll colour in blue, over here, Pedalura, he was basically a Ukrainian nationalist that was fighting for a separate Ukraine. All of this is going on while the Civil War is raging, and it makes it a very complex and complicated war. The main protagonists are the Reds against the Whites, but as you can see, there are different groups out here that do have issues, do want to break away from Russia, and unfortunately for them, the Red victory at the end of the Civil War just pulls them back in to what becomes the Soviet Union. Just stopping and thinking about what the Civil War was, it's really, Orlando Figes here suggests that it was kind of almost inevitable. And it's interesting that he suggests that for Lenin and most of his followers, civil war was a vital phase in a social revolution. So he suggests that as the Bolsheviks saw it, a civil war was no more than a violent form of class struggle. Remember, what the Bolsheviks have started is a class war. It's a revolution from beneath to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. So it is a class war. And what Figes is suggesting is that Lenin really sees the Civil War as an extension of that revolution. It's not something separate, but rather an inevitable clash that would take place. He goes on to suggest that there was no real distinction in their mind, the Bolsheviks' mind, between military conflict and social conflict in every town and village. And if we think of it that way, it might help us to explain things like the Red Terror that takes place as part of the Civil War, and certainly, an attack against the peasants to ensure that they would follow the Bolshevik way of thinking. We'll come back to that later on. So if we take a quick look at the Red Army and who it was and how it was formed, because if we go back to October 1917, there is no Red Army, of course. There is, however, the Red Guard. And the Red Guard, as we remember, was quite a motley crew, really. Armed, yes, loyal to the Bolsheviks to some extent. But what we see from January 1918 is a much more organised approach. And it's Trotsky here who does the organising. He gets the job as Minister for War, and basically sets up the Red Army. So he bases it on the Red Guard, but he needs a lot more. As conflict expands in 1918, he really needs quite a large army. You might recall that one of the reforms that the Bolsheviks introduced was getting rid of things like salutes, getting rid of hierarchy and ranks within the army. Well, in 1918 it comes back. The reason being that the Reds, the Bolsheviks, suddenly need a disciplined force in order to have their military victory. One of the ways that Trotsky recruits people into the army is he actually does use officers from the former Tsar's army. Now you might say, hang on, aren't they anti-Bolshevik? Aren't they against the Bolsheviks? Don't they have a slightly more conservative approach? Many of them did. Many of them, however, were supportive of the new Bolshevik approach. And as we'll see in a moment, the Red Army also had a way to keep those who perhaps weren't as ideologically supportive as they could have been. The Red Army had a way to force those officers to become a part of the Red Army and stay a part of the Red Army. In the end, the reason why Trotsky, with Lenin's approval, has these officers as part of the new Bolshevik Red Army is because he needs them. He needs the experience, and they are key in actually training new Red Army troops and getting them ready for the field. To boost the numbers as we move into 1918, we see conscription reintroduced. Had been a part of Russia in the past, of course, but the Red Army is needing numbers. And so by 1919, the Red Army has built with conscription to 3 million men. On paper, it outnumbered the White Army by 10 to 1, which is significantly more. But you do have to remember that the Red Army was not necessarily well trained. A lot of them are peasants who have had very little of former experience. There is also within the Red Army a lot of disease and a lot of desertion. The Red Army soldiers are not necessarily treated well, and that's because there's not a lot of food to go around. Things are pretty harsh during the Civil War. We see about 15% per year deserting the ranks. That's how difficult it is. Whether you are ideologically supportive of the Bolsheviks or not, being a part of the Red Army was tough, was difficult. And despite the potential threats against their families, Red Army members did desert at a very high rate. So I'm going to leave it there. We've had a little bit of an introduction to the Civil War and what is going on, and a bit of an introduction to the Red Army. And I'll come back in the next part and we'll take a look at some of the key people involved in the Civil War.